Here in the social sciences at UCLA, movements for social justice motivate many of our researchers to gain a better understanding of the forces that shape the world around us. We're in a society now where large segments of the population have very little faith in our most central institutions. And throughout our history, we've seen various social movements and uprisings that were provoked by instances of injustice. The work we do here in the division hopefully will empower communities, community-based organizations, to lead the challenge towards a more just future.
The impact of mass incarceration in Los Angeles, as its impact across the country, is that it sucks up all the resources in the bank, in the public sphere. And all of our public dollars are going to policing and incarceration, when the vast majority of people that we're arresting are being arrested for public health crises. What does it mean when we take those dollars out of policing and incarceration and move it over into housing, move it into summer jobs for young people, and so on? Los Angeles operates the largest jail system, some say in the United States and others say on Earth. So I have the opportunity here to be in the belly of the beast, to really look from the inside out. I also really appreciate being here at UCLA because I do feel that this is a university that values this kind of applied, activist, action-oriented research. And so I've had the opportunity here to thrive in my career in ways that I'm not sure I would have done at other universities.
I'm often asked about the anti-immigrant rhetoric that seems so pervasive. And what I like to share with students and with other colleagues is what we do best on our campus, which is to double down on empirics, on data, on evidence about immigrants and their impact. In that same way, we also push for solutions. So I think what makes UCLA stand apart, in particular, is the Division of Social Sciences. And this is where we can engage in all components, if you will, about immigrant lives, immigrant work, immigrant culture, immigrant food, all the multiple contributions and nuances that they bring to our society. I think all of this is what makes the work that we do in the division so unique, as well as so important. The ability to do analysis in a multidisciplinary fashion, and perhaps more importantly, to push for equity and to push for social justice. My name is Abel Valenzuela, and I'm professor of Chicano Studies and Central American Studies, Labor Studies, and Urban Planning.
My name is Kelly Lytle Hernandez. I'm a professor of History, African American Studies, and Urban Planning here at UCLA.
My name is Darnell Hunt. I'm Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA, Professor of Sociology and African American Studies. If you'd like to learn more about the cutting-edge, community-engaged scholarship here, please subscribe to our e-forum, LA Social Science. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our Dean Salon, the 2021 Hollywood Diversity Report, Lessons Learned. And you know, it's quite fitting, the video you just saw that talked about our work in the social sciences, looking at movements for social justice. Clearly, Hollywood diversity is an issue that we could label as a social justice matter. And I want to talk to you today about a series of studies we've done since 2014, looking at the inclusion and access for people of color and women in the Hollywood industry. So why don't we go ahead and run that PowerPoint here now. This is a project that in the division is administered by the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. Next slide. And you can advance one more. So the 2021 Hollywood Diversity Report was subtitled Pandemic in Progress, because obviously the big event of 2020, which is the year that we examined in film, was the pandemic and its impact on the industry. Forward. Okay, so click again, please. So this is a chart that shows us what's happening with the US population between 1960 and about 2050. I'm going to show you two different trend lines, one for the white population and another for the people of color population. Click. You see here that the white population declined from about 85% of the overall population in 1960 to about 47% in 2050. Next line. And you see here the opposite is happening with the people of color population. In 2020, the year that we're examining, you see that people of color made up about 40.3% of the population. The lines are going to cross around 2042 or so, and from that point forward, the US will be a majority minority nation. That's important to remember because some of the charts we're going to see a little bit later compare what's happening in Hollywood to the minority share of the overall population. Next slide, please. So the data for this particular study come from 185 films that were released in 2020. And these films were either in theaters or streaming. Of course, because of the pandemic, we had a much larger number of films that were actually streamed in 2020. And that had an impact that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Click. 463 scripted TV shows from the 2018-19 television season. Click. Lead talent, race and gender. Click. Director, race and gender. Click. We also look at show creator, race and gender. Click. Writer diversity. Click one more time. Box office figures, audience demos, and international markets. Click. And last but not least, we also look at household, viewer, and social media ratings. Part of what we do in the study is relate the degree of diversity you see on screen to how the films and TV shows actually do in the market. All right, next slide. So we're going to start out by talking about what we found for film in 2020. Next slide. Click. All right, so here you have a chart that's going to look at film leads. Film leads, of course, are important. Those are the key featured character in the film, the one around whom the story revolves. I'm going to show you what it looks like for whites. We see that in 2012, about 84.9% of the leads were white. By 2020, that figure had dropped to 60.3%. Click. We see the corresponding lines for people of color, 15.1% in 2012, up to 39.7% in 2020. So a pretty remarkable upward trend. Click one more time. Here we have the population line. We see what has happened with the US population since we started this study looking at the 2012 year. And we see that for the first time in 2020, that people of color almost reached proportionate representation among film leads, 39.7% of the leads when people of color make up 40.3% of the population. That's a notable achievement. We've never seen that in history before. So that's something to keep in mind, at least in front of the camera. Next slide, please. If we look at film leads by gender, click, we see the same type of chart. Click once, you'll see the line for males. 69.2% of the leads in 2012 were males, down to 52.2% in 2020. Click. And here's the line for women. You see that there was a big gap in 2012. Well, that gap closed appreciably by 2020 to the point where women almost reached parity with their male counterparts. Women account for slightly more than half of the population, but they were 47.8% of the leads in 2020. Next slide, please. Here we're looking at film directors. We're doing the same type of analysis by race. We'll look at the white population first. We see that 89% of the directors, film directors in 2012 were white, down to 74.6% in 2020. The next line is for minorities. We see from 11% in 2012 up to 25.4% in 2020. So again, a pretty meaningful trend, upward trend, more than double what we saw in 2012. But when we look at the population line, we see that people of color still have a long way to go in the ranks of directors. In 2020, only about 25.4% of the directors, they'd have to increase their share by 15 percentage points to reach proportionate representation among film directors. Next slide, please. Here we have the same analysis for women, for gender. The first line is for male directors, 94.2% of the directors in 2012, down to 78.9% in 2020. For women, 5.8% in 2012, and nearly quadruple that to 20.5% in 2020. But as you can see, the gap is still pretty large. Women have not reached parity with their male counterparts, despite nearly quadrupling their share of directors since we first started looking at this for the 2012 year. Next slide, please. We look at writers. If we look at white writers, we see that 92.2% of those credited with writing films in 2012 were white, down to 74.1% in 2020. The next line is from minorities. Again, you saw a huge increase from 7.8% in 2012 to 25.9% in 2020. But again, if you look at the population line, we still have a ways to go. Not quite as far as with directors, but in the same neighborhood. They'd have to increase their share by about 14 percentage points to reach proportionate representation, people of color would. Next slide, please. Looking at this for women, we see that the male share was 87% in 2012, down to 73.5% in 2020. For women, 13% in 2012, up to 26%, so exactly doubling their share of writers. But again, the gap is still there, and to reach parity, women would have to nearly double again their share of writing credits in film. Next slide. So here's a chart that's quite telling. We saw quite a bit of progress in front of the camera in film, particularly among leads for people of color and women. But if you look behind the scenes at the executive suites, where the decisions are made about what gets greenlighted, what the budget's going to be, who's going to be hired, that type of thing, we see that it's still a largely white male-dominated world. In fact, among the chairs and CEOs of the top studios in 2020, 91% were white and 82% were male. If you look a level down at senior executives, we see that 93% were white, 80% were male. And it's only when you get down to the unit heads do you see a little bit more gender diversity. The head of casting, the head of marketing, et cetera, 86% white and only 59% male. I say only 59% male. All right, next slide. We're going to look at some charts for television to see how that compares to film. Next slide. So if we look at broadcast, and we break this up into broadcast, cable, and streaming or digital, because they're different platforms and the patterns are slightly different. But here, if we do the same type of analysis we did for film, we see that 94.9% of the broadcast leads in 2011-12 were white, down to 76% in 2018-19, which was the last season we examined in the 2020 Hollywood Diversity Report. I should note that we have a new report coming out in the fall that'll look at the 2019-2020 season. If we look at people of color, 5.1% of the leads were people of color in 2011-12, up to 24% in 2018-19. So again, more than 4 times the share they had in 2011-12. You see a steady uptick. But again, if you look at the population line, we see we still have a ways to go before people of color will reach proportionate representation among broadcast leads. Next slide, please. Looking at the same analysis for gender, we see that males represented 51.5% of the leads in 2011-12. Their share has actually increased to 55.2% by 2018-19. And looking at women, again, you saw pretty much parity in the early years of our study, but then a widening gap in the middle years, and the trend has been towards more parity in recent years. Women still have about 7 percentage points to gain before they reach parity, or I guess proportionate representation, given their share of the population among broadcast leads. Next slide, please. If we look at cable leads by race, we see here that for whites, in 2011-12, they accounted for 85.3% of the leads, down to 65% in 2018-19. So a little bit better than what we saw in broadcast. For people of color, again, another upward trend, 14.7% in 2011-12, and more than double that to 35% in 2018-19. Again, if we look at the population figure, we see the gap is not quite as big as we saw in broadcast. People of color only have about 6 percentage points to gain before they reach proportionate representation among leads in cable. Next slide, please. Cable leads by gender. We see here 2011-12 for men. 62.8% of the leads were men, down to 55.2% in 2018-19. And for women, the gap has closed somewhat. By 2018-19, women were 44.8% of the leads, very similar to what we saw in broadcast. Next slide, please. Here we start looking at the digital realm, which has really increased in prominence over the years since we did our first report in 2014. In 2013-14, 90.9% of the leads in digital were white, down to 75.9% in 2018-19. For people of color, the opposite direction in terms of the trend, 9.1% of the leads were people of color in 2013-14, up to 24.1% in 2018-19. But again, we look at the population line, we see we have a ways to go before we reach proportionate representation among leads in the digital space. Next slide, please. Looking at the same thing in the digital space for gender, men accounted for 64.7% of the leads in 2013-14, down to 50.6% in 2018-19. And here again, women have more or less closed the gap. As of the last year, we looked at 2018-19, accounting for 49.4% of the leads in the digital space. Next slide, please. If we look at the show creators, the people who actually came up with the ideas for the shows, this is significant because it tells us sort of, what's happening behind the scenes and whose stories are being told. In 2011-12, 95.8% of show creators were white. So virtually all shows created in the broadcast space were created by white people who came up with the story ideas. Down to 89.3% in 2018-19. The corresponding line for people of color, a measly 4.2% in 2011-12, up to 10.7% in 2018-19. So a little bit more than doubling. But again, if you look at the population line, you see that people of color would have to nearly quadruple their share of broadcast show creators to reach proportionate representation, a much bigger gap than what we saw in front of the camera. So that's important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Looking at the same thing by gender, broadcast show creators, 73.5% were men in 2011-12, roughly the same, not a lot of change here, 71.9% in 2018-19. And for women, again, 26.5% in 2011-12, 28.1% in 2018-19. So over 8 years of our study, you see very little change happening behind the scenes with respect to gender and who's telling the stories. Most of the show creators continue to be men in the broadcast space. Next slide, please. If we look at cable show creators by race, 2011-12, 92.6% were white, down to 85.5% in 2018-19. The corresponding line for people of color, again, a similar pattern to what we saw in broadcast, 7.4% in 2011-12, doubling to about 14.5% in 2018-19. But again, if we look at the population, we see there's a huge gap. People of color are woefully underrepresented among show creators in the cable space. Next slide, please. Here we have cable show creators by gender. 78.5% were men in 2011-12, 77.6% in 2018-19. Again, not a lot of change. If you look at the corresponding line for women, 21.5% in 2011-12, 22.4% in 2018-19. Again, behind the scenes, we don't see a big shift in terms of what's happening with gender among show creators. Next slide, please. If we look at digital show creators by race, 2013-14, 93.8% were white, down a bit to 89.7% in 2018-19. If you look at the corresponding line for people of color, 6.2% in 2013-14, up to 10.3% in 2018-19. And again, the population line tells the story. People of color have a long way to go behind the scenes in digital, just as they did in cable and broadcast. Next slide, please. If we look at digital show creators by gender, 2013-14, 84.4% were male, down to 71.4% in 2018-19. So a more sizable shift. And 15.6% were women in 2013-14, up to 28.6% in 2018-19, nearly double. So again, women are doing a little bit better among show creators in digital space than in broadcast and cable. Next slide, please. Now we look at the people who get credited for writing the episodes of individual broadcast, cable, and digital shows. And what we do is we track the share over time that are people of color, women, etc. So here we see in 2012-13 that 92.3% of the credited writers in broadcast were white. By 2018-19, that figure had dropped to 76.6%. The corresponding figure for people of color shows an upward trend, 9.7% in 2012-13, up to 23.4% in 2018-19. But again, as you can see from the population line, we still have a ways to go before the people actually writing the stories are representative of the minority share of the population at 40.2%. Next slide, please. If we look at credited cable writers by race, we see here 88.2% in 2012-13 were white, down to 74.2% in 2018-19. And again, you see a corresponding upward trend for people of color, 11.8% in 2012-13, up to 25.8% in 2018-19. And again, the minority line shows you, the population line shows you the gap is still quite significant. We have a ways to go with people of color before they reach proportionate representation among those credited writers in cable. Next slide, please. If we look at credited digital writers by race, 2014-15, 89.2% were white, down to 77.2% in 2018-19, very similar trend. People of color, 10.8%, 2014-15, up to 22.8% in 2018-19, so a little bit more than doubling, but still a ways to go to catch up with where the population is. Next slide, please. So here in TV, we see a similar story behind the scenes. We see some progress in front of the camera, but behind the scenes, we see a lot of stagnation. The same is true in the executive suites. In 2020, they were 92% white and 68% male in the TV networks. And if we look a level down to the senior executives, again, 84% white, 60% male, and the unit heads, 87% white and 54% male. So we have a long way to go behind the scenes for the people who are making the decisions, which ultimately affect the whole ecosystem, the whole Hollywood ecosystem in terms of inclusion and marginalization. Next slide, please. So now what I want to do is quickly talk about the significance of all this for the bottom line. Next slide. So here we have a chart that essentially takes all of the Hollywood films that were released in theaters in 2020 that we examined in our study, and we're talking about 56 films here, and groups them into different buckets based on how diverse the cast of the film is, the main cast. And those buckets are movies that have a cast that's less than 11% diverse or people of color, movies whose casts are from 11 to 20% people of color, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, and majority minority cast, over 50%. And the question we ask is, where do box office revenues peak? In what category? Click. And what we saw in 2020 was that films that were from 41 to 50% people of color in their main cast, those were the films that on average had the highest box office. In other words, relatively diverse films did better at the box office. And it's notable that the films that did worse at the box office were the ones that were the least diverse. And this is something that we found year after year after year since we started doing this study in 2014. And so one of the questions you might ask is, if the industry is in business to make money and they're making lots of films that aren't very diverse, that aren't making a lot of money, why are they making those films as opposed to more diverse films? And that's something we'll get into a little bit later. Next slide, please. We did the same type of analysis in 2020 for streaming films because so many more films were released in 2020 via streaming platforms because of the pandemic. You know, theaters were shuttered for most of the year. So we actually had 87 films for which we had ratings data that we can do a similar type of analysis, looking at the diversity of the film and how well it did in the ratings. Click. And what we found among films on streaming platforms, the films that had the highest ratings, and we're looking at viewers 18 to 49 ratings, those ratings peaked for films that were from 21 to 30% people of color. So again, you know, not quite as diverse as the films that did the best in theaters, but pretty diverse compared to the ones that were, say, less than 11% people of color, between 11 and 20% people of color. Next slide, please. Here we do the same type of analysis for broadcast scripted television shows, and we're looking at median 18 to 49 viewer ratings. And click. And interestingly, here we found that it was actually the films that, the TV shows that were least diverse that had the highest median 18 to 49 viewer ratings. And we've seen interesting anomalies with this over the last few years. It kind of goes back and forth. But generally speaking, over the course of this report series, the TV shows that were more diverse, or at least looked more like America's diversity, from 31 to 40% diverse, were the ones that did best. Here, we think it had to do with the migration of a lot of viewers away from broadcast to streaming, to cable, and to other platforms to explain some of this. Because if you move to the next slide and look at this analysis for Black households, for example, on broadcast, click, you see that it's actually television shows that are over 50% people of color in the cast that do the best in terms of household ratings. Next slide, please. If we look at cable and do the same type of analysis, looking at median viewer ratings 18 to 49, click. Again, you see it's TV shows with casts that are majority minority that do the best in terms of median 18 to 49 viewer ratings. Next slide. So here on the left is the cover of the 2021 report that we released back in April. And the 2020 report, the April report focused on film. The 2020 report that was released in late 2020 focused on television. As I noted at the outset, we're going to release a new report, 2021 part 2, this coming fall, to look at the 2019-20 television season. So what I'm going to do now, now that we're done with the PowerPoint, is I want to introduce this amazing panel who's going to help us make sense of all of this. First up, I'd like to introduce Amberia Allen. Amberia Allen is a writer and performer who holds a Ph.D. in sociology from UCLA. She has appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, has written for The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, the Oscars, and is currently staffed on the Wonder Years reboot. We'll have to talk more about that. While at UCLA, Amberia served as a researcher and one of the co-authors of the annual Hollywood Diversity Report. So she kind of knows what I've been talking about. And her work examines how women navigate sexual harassment and threats to their professional identities in the entertainment industry. Next up, we have Nancy Yuen. Nancy Yuen is professor of sociology at Biola University and a pop culture expert. She is author of the book, Real Inequality, Hollywood Actors and Racism, and co-author of Tokens on the Small Screen, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Primetime and Streaming Television, and the Prevalence and Portrayal of Asian and Pacific Islanders across 1,300 popular films. Her work has been featured in dozens of media outlets, including PBS, NPR, MSNBC, New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and like Amberia, she holds a PhD in sociology from UCLA. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Ana-Christina Ramón. Ana-Christina Ramón is the Director of Research and Civic Engagement for the Division of Social Sciences at UCLA. She is a social psychologist who has worked on social justice issues related to equity and access in higher education and the entertainment industry for over 15 years. She is the co-principal investigator of the Hollywood Advancement Project and manages its graduate student research team. She is the co-author with me of the annual Hollywood Diversity Report series that the project produces. And the Latino Film Institute recently named her its initial LFI scholar. So why don't we get started? I have a couple of questions I want to get this conversation going. Hopefully we can have a pretty informal conversation bouncing off of each other's observations and so forth. But I'm going to start with you, Amberia. So you're one of those rare individuals who has both studied Hollywood diversity and inclusion practices, and you've lived them in your roles as both a television writer and performer. Can you talk a bit about how your experiences working in the industry have compared to what you learned studying it?
Yeah, I mean, I think studying it was great preparation for what I experienced trying to navigate the industry in different ways as both a performer and a writer. And I think what I learned the most is the critical aspect of diversifying Hollywood are those data points that you discussed, the executives, the folks who make the decisions, right? And diversifying those ranks kind of trickles down in other spaces. And until we see shifts in those positions, it's very difficult to see shifts kind of on the micro level. And that's kind of where a lot of the work is done among people of color who are in the industry. Whereas other folks kind of benefit from having agency representation and being recruited in formal ways via formal avenues. People of color are often recruited by other talent of color, right? So you're doing the work of navigating your own career while also trying to help others navigate theirs and get introduced into formal networks. So that's a lot of work done on the individual level. And that contributes to a lot of the shifts that we've seen in the past. I mean, since we started doing this research and we were literally counting people of color and it wasn't that difficult to do, to now seeing some pretty significant shifts. But a lot of that is done on the micro level interactionally and in interpersonal networks. And that is, that makes change very slow.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting point. I want to come back to a couple of points you mentioned in a few minutes. But first I want to ask Nancy, so you've worked on a number of interesting projects over the years, tracking the experiences of people of Asian descent, Pacific Islanders, and sort of kind of their positioning in the Hollywood industry, or in some cases, in most cases, their lack of positioning. What surprised you the most about this work?
I think that since, I'm a qualitative researcher in general, though the reports that I worked on, I think were quantitative and qualitative, but in terms of interviews, I'll just, echo what Amberia said about on the ground. I think a lot of the actors that I spoke to really felt very called, to the craft, but also they were very much activists. Because I think I started off my book project, which was my dissertation project at UCLA, like curious about why actors of color would even do what they do. Like why go into a field where you're just going to have to play stereotypes or, not get any role because they're looking for white actors. And
Right.
what I found was that a lot of them felt very passionate, including Asian American actors who would negotiate like costuming or negotiate behavior, negotiate accents where, they would go in. I mean, even to this day, I have Asian American working actors who say they're still being asked to do an accent in the audition room. And of course, they're trying to think of creative ways on how to change the stereotype without pulling out the race card. Like, they're not going to say that's racist because that's just not going to work out in Hollywood.
Probably not going
Although,
to lead
I think we're
probably
talking
not
about
going to
it
lead to
more.
getting the job, right?
Right. I mean, I think more and more people are
Yeah.
at least aware of
Yeah.
these issues, but it's not like I think those expectations have totally changed, right? And so trying to navigate, they don't have a lot of power. I think I found out that they have less power than I thought, but also they have more creativity than I anticipated. So yeah, and we could talk about most recent studies, but those are from like my qualitative research. I think I was very excited to see what the actors were trying to do behind the scenes, and imagining as an audience member, wow, the final product is a combination of so many people, I think, negotiating and navigating these representations.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a collective process, and seeing how people sort of insert their own perspective and sort of experiences into the process, it can be quite eye-opening. I remember you had some pretty interesting anecdotes in your dissertation about dilemmas of authenticity that different actors had, and trying to figure out, okay, I really need this job, but how can I do this and maintain my self-respect? It's really interesting dance that one has to engage in. Ana-Christina, so we've worked together on the Hollywood Diversity Report for more than 10 years now. I mean, if you count all the years that led to the design of the report, when we spent time, traveling through the industry and talking to networks and studios about, what would make a difference in terms of data. So in thinking about that process from where we started in, say, 2012 to the release of the first report in 2014 through the release of the last report a couple of months ago. What's your biggest takeaway from the research process that led to, I think, where we are today with the report?
I think that it's kind of what Amberia was talking about earlier, that at the beginning, there was just such like limited content that featured people of color as the leads or the, biggest part of the cast, those, majority minority films. And through the years, you've seen that progression that things have increased in front of the camera, but not behind the camera. And so the process has obviously evolved for us because of the fact that there is so much more content, right? And so the fact that for the digital platforms for streaming, it's really just, it's an astronomical like increase, right? And partly because of Netflix. And so that's very interesting to see from where we started to where we are now in terms of what people are watching. So, it was first, the focus was broadcast and cable and just a little bit of digital. We were just barely looking into it. And then the second year we did the report, that's when, we really started looking into more about what the numbers were showing, right, in terms of representation. And then it's just expanded, so much. So I find that, really interesting in terms of the years that we've been doing the report. We've seen this like evolution, this, that's quickly kind of occurred in a way, right? For like the way that, things have been for so many years, right? That it was really just broadcast and then it was cable and then all of a sudden now streaming is, the biggest platform in a lot of ways. But I think what's really interesting is that our finding has always shown that even with those at the first year with the few films that, that had this diverse content, we saw that diversity sells, right? And that has been a consistent finding for us in film and in television and in terms of like the diverse cast, right? And that's something we found every year. And so so it is good that things have improved, but there's so much more to go, as you showed with the slides earlier. But I think that what's key for our study is that we connected to that bottom line, and then we're showing the business part of it, the economic piece of it. That's really key.
Yeah, they don't call it show business for nothing, right? One of our earliest interviews when we were taking that listening tour, I think it was back in 2012. I won't name the network or the individual who told us that, but they said, if you can tie it to the bottom line, then maybe people will notice or pay attention. So that was important advice. So the video that began this salon talked about some of the work in the social sciences at UCLA, movements for social justice. Can each of you talk maybe for a minute or two about the ways in which social justice may relate to these questions of Hollywood diversity, access, that type of thing? Why should we care about this? It's entertainment, right? But is it a social justice issue? Amberia, do you want to take a stab at that?
I actually wanted to defer to Nancy because I know she has some interesting
okay.
findings that I want
people
to
on
listen to and then speak. But I'm happy to. But I know you have.
Well, whoever wants to take the first bite, Nancy.
Stuff that I was interested in learning about. But please.
Sure, happy to do so. Actually, if we could bring up, let me see that it's like slide number 6. This is data from the most recent USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative and Stacey L. Smith and myself. This just came out, gosh, this last month. And we did, we also did a lot of quantitative and qualitative, but I focused on the qualitative, and we found really disturbing was that over 25% of it was primary and secondary Asian and Pacific Islander characters on screen in 2019. These are the top 100 box office films, right? So these are the ones that are reaching the most people. and over 25% of them died before the end of the film, right? And 41% experienced some sort of disparagement. And then the deaths were violent, all but one were violent. And then there was also racist, sexist slurs, right? And I mean, there weren't too many, but I think any in these top films, especially when they're not necessarily contextualized, they're just kind of, a lot of times I think when Hollywood represents racism, it's not very nuanced, you know, it's just kind of like, it's just like, I think for them, it's just another kind of, you know, insult, like toxic masculinity insult kind of thing, but they're not thinking about, oh, well, if it's just said like that by one of the lead characters, it actually might be seen as okay to do, right, in society. And so all these things couched in the fact that we have a huge rise in anti-Asian hate. You know, in fact, the stopapihate.org reporting has documented, you know, or has collected over 6,000, and these are just the ones that are reported. We know there are so many more that aren't reported. And so I think that the fact that Hollywood continues to represent and dehumanize and kind of disparage and really dispensable, right? API lives are like dispensable on screen. It's very concerning, especially during this time when, you know, when we appear to be dispensable in U.S. society, you know, with the anti-Asian hate. So it's very discouraging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Amberia or Ana-Christina, either one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Nancy, your data about audience reception and the ways in which representation shapes our perception of certain groups and subsequent our actions toward those groups is interesting. And when I think of social justice in the entertainment industry, I also just think of like workplace equality, right? And issues around workplace equality. This is still a workplace for actors and for writers. And unequal access to income, you know, wage equality, the way in which you can, there's, you know, advancement up the ranks is something that is still an issue for people of color who are working in the industry. Many folks, I mean, just like any other industry, our work is tied to our health benefits. Which became a point of contention during the pandemic when a lot of folks were out of work and didn't have access to healthcare. And that was mostly people of color who didn't have access to healthcare because they didn't have enough credits because the work that they're doing is not covered by a guild, right? It's, or they don't earn enough to be covered or covered during a certain duration, right? So all of those issues are social justice issues, right? It's healthcare, it's employment. And then there's just other issues about the experiences of women and people of color in these workplaces, which I think we might get into a little bit later, but those are social justice issues, discrimination in the workplace. So entertainment is a broad thing, right? And when you kind of pick it apart, you can look at the ways in which there are myriad influences, Nancy, audience reception, and then just regular old workplace issues that I find particularly interesting.
Can I just jump in really quick?
Sure.
Because Daniel Day Kim, if we could put up slide 7, Daniel Day Kim actually recently in an article said that he he dropped out of Hawaii Five-0 because of a lack of pay. And that was, you know, that was a controversy, I think, or not controversy, but it was a big deal that he and Grace Park left because of wage discrepancy. And then he said that he wasn't paid on Hawaii Five-0 as much as he was on Lost. So that was the previous television show that he kind of blew up on. And then he tweeted this right after our study came out, that basically he dies on screen all the time. And I just felt, just as you were talking, Amberia, I was thinking, you know, when you die on screen, when you're not playing a role that is significant, and then you don't get paid, it's like all of this is coming together, interacting, right? In terms of types of representation that hurts society, and then inequitable pay, you know, and inequitable representation in terms of types of characters and how long you're on screen and how significant you are to the story. So.
Yeah. I think often when we think about actors and writers, we think of this job as like a luxury job, right? So it's like we get upset when people are trying to negotiate a salary for $500,000, but it's like that's the going rate, right? So if that's the going rate, that's what anyone should be paid doing the same labor. So I think we have to like put it in context. And not everybody is trying to negotiate $500,000 contracts. Sometimes it's just regular salaries, right?
Yeah, no, those are really important points. Ana-Christina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to talk about, we're talking about kind of stereotypical and limited representation and how problematic that is. And, in addition, there's the like Gerbner and Gross's, theory about symbolic annihilation, right? So a lack of representation or no representation at all in media is, equals symbolic annihilation pretty much. And you can see that for like the native groups, right? And so the fact that, there was like a survey done a few years ago that showed that 40% of Americans thought that Native people did not exist anymore, right? And so, just the fact that there's hardly any representation, on screen in television and films of Native Americans, and it's just a big, problem, and it affects kind of policy, it affects, the coverage, right? Affects like that 24-hour cable news cycle. So any issues that they're facing, they don't get the reporters to go out there because the cable news probably thinks that they're not going to get any ratings if they cover it. And so then policies are, impacted, and obviously, that affects everything about the, their civil rights, their human rights, and it's just such a major problem. And I think that, for Native peoples, that's a big issue, and it kind of expands to other groups when they have pretty much like this erasure, right? That we find, and when they do show up, it's very limited, very stereotypical, very one-dimensional, and that's a big problem.
Sure. And of course, Latinx people, constitute the largest underrepresented minority group in the US today. And the Latino Film Institute, when they sort of selected you as their initial inaugural film scholar, it was really for the work that you've done in sort of, raising our awareness about what's happening with Latinx people in Hollywood. Can you talk a little bit about some of the biggest takeaways from that work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for the lack of representation for Latinos, it's really a shameful thing because of the fact that, at 19%, about 19% of the population, they only represent about 5 or 6% of leads or overall cast. And that's in both film and television, right? And so then you wonder like what kind of images, what kind of representation people are seeing, because out of that 5 or 6%, not all of them, those, characters are gonna be just authentic or real. Some of them might be very limited, very stereotypical. But the one thing that's interesting is that when you look at the audience, you see that the Latinx audience are really avid moviegoers, right? And so they are overrepresented in terms of being ticket buyers. They buy more tickets per person per year, at the movies. They're overrepresented in all those areas. And then they also, when they watch entertainment at home, even if they don't have Wi-Fi at home, they watch it on their smartphone. They're overrepresented as smartphone users of entertainment. They subscribe to more digital platforms. They subscribe to more than one usually, and so they're watching content everywhere, and they really want to see entertainment. So it's just really interesting that they're underestimated and undervalued in Hollywood, right? And so Hollywood is not producing anywhere near proportionate representation for them on screen and then behind the scenes. And so it's just something that I think is needs to really have like a big focus, right, and a really big push, because the continued underinvestment of Latinx films, or at least just even just casting more Latinx actors and hiring more writers, even if they don't write about necessarily something that's quote unquote Latinx content, it's just that it's going to be a bigger issue because the population keeps growing.
Yeah, yeah. So what I'm hearing here, I mean, listening to you all talk is, thinking again about, this issue of Hollywood diversity as a social justice issue. It's really two dimensions. On one dimension, it's about some of the things that Amberia was talking about in terms of equal, pay, fair working conditions, access to employment. And then on the other dimension, it's really about the representational. It's about the images that are created and the impact they might have if groups are excluded altogether, the symbolic annihilation that Ana-Christina talked about, I guess the promotion of hate crimes and other things that Nancy referenced. Images matter. I mean, it's entertainment, but it's not just entertainment. It also affects the way people see one another, particularly if they don't have access to firsthand experiences with people. They kind of take what they see in Hollywood representations as real, and that can have real consequences. So what do we do about all this? So we've been tracking this for years, and we see some progress in front of the camera. We've seen that pretty remarkable, actually, in the last year. And again, we don't know how much of that is going to be because it was an aberrant year because of the pandemic, and so many of the films that we studied were released via streaming platforms. I guess we'll know next year. We'll probably get a better register on that, and we may see a little bit more with TV in the fall. But even without the outlier year of last year, there's been a clear march towards more on-screen diversity. What we haven't seen at the same pace is diversity behind the screen, where the decisions are made. What's that all about? Any thoughts about that? Particularly for those of you who've had contact with, kind of the day-to-day operations of the industry. Why is it that we see more progress in front of the camera than we do behind the camera?
I think that progress in front of the camera is easier to make, and there are fewer stakes involved with making changes in front of the camera. Behind the camera is more money, it's more decisions, it's more power. So if you shift the power dynamic, I mean, that's no one wants to relinquish power. I guess that's the easy, that's the easy answer. And a lot of it is also doing business the way they've done business. I mean, you've mentioned every year we found that diversity sells, and yet the change has been slow. So it's not just about the bottom line. It's about old practices. It's about biases. It's about not wanting to let go of power and positions. Because once that shifts, right, then, once 2042 arrives, right, then what does that look like? And people not knowing how to operate in a diverse space and being afraid of that, right? What does it mean? How will I be held accountable if the dynamics of this room changes, right? That's a scary thing for people in positions of power. What can I say? What can I not say? How will it challenge me? And I think that is also something that leads to the slow path toward diversity.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole session on writers' room dynamics. I'm sure. I mean, it's a fascinating space.
Oh goodness, yeah. We'll have to do a couple of these to
Nancy,
really.
you have any thoughts about this?
I think that it's not for a lack of talent, right? We have Chloe Zhao, who's the first woman of color who was nominated and won Best Director Oscar this year. Bong Joon-ho actually won last year. We're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? There's two Asian actors that won. It's kind of like the Mexican directors. You're like, oh my gosh, things are going to get better. But a lot of times they're not necessary. I mean, Bong Joon-ho aside, he's doing film in Korea, but a lot of them are not necessarily making films. It's weird. It's like the matching of in front of the scenes and behind the scenes isn't always one-to-one when it comes to talent. And of course, we're talking about so very few. I think that so I totally agree with what Amberia said, and also the power and the networks, right? So then who are in those networks? Like I've been consulting with companies, and a lot of times it's white. And the talent agents, they package everybody together, right? So it's like a whole slew of the powerful talent agents. Like it's like they put the director and the screenwriter and everybody's together, and they're all white, right? And it's like you buy this one package deal, and then they think, oh my gosh, we're gonna get in trouble because everybody's white, and then they bring in consultants that have no power, right? We have no power. I will say what I say, but there may not be any. I have no they can choose not to listen to me at all. Right, versus someone who is actually a director or a producer and not kind of just thrown in there for tokenism. And so all of that I think is problematic and will be very slow to change because of the kind of old boys club.
Yeah, and one of the things that I guess people have talked about in the industry for years is that, it's this whole comfort level thing we have. I mean, people tend to hire people they've worked with in the past. They feel comfortable with them. It's a high pressure industry. You're on deadline. You're working these long hours. And so it's like path of least resistance. You just go with people that are like known and true. You've worked with them before. Well, if you're already starting out with an industry that's dominated by white men, well, guess what? You're reproducing that same structure over and over and over again. That's typically what happens. Ana-Christina, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think I found it interesting with when we looked at the executives and compare it to 5 years ago when we first looked at it, that the increases that we saw were with white women. So if there was more quote unquote diversity, it benefited white women the most over the last 5 years. And so, then there's still that issue of like this lack of cultural understanding. And I've spoken with, other content creators that are people of color that have gone to pitch their shows or their films, and they say, I don't go into a room with all white men. That's actually not the case. They're like, I go into a room with all white women, and they still don't understand why my story is this way. Why can't I change it? They say, you should try something else. I don't get it. And so, they say, yeah, maybe there's somebody else above them that's a white man or whatever, but they were saying like, my recent experiences are with these white women that they don't really understand, what my story is and why it's important to tell it from my perspective. And then that's still a problem.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue. The structure of the industry makes it really hard to make meaningful and sustained progress on a lot of these fronts. It just so happens that in front of the camera, it's been easier, and we think streaming has had a lot to do with that, and the way that that's changed television. And we're living in this renaissance of TV right now, where a lot of the content on TV is better than what you see in theaters now. And that's created opportunities for storytellers of color and women to tell stories that wouldn't have been told before. And guess what? Audiences love it and critics like it. And so that's kind of shifted, their image of what's viable programming now. You haven't seen the same type of shift in film, although this year is going to be interesting given the fact that there were so many films released via streaming platforms and they did pretty well, relative, diverse films did well relative to ones that weren't as diverse. So we'll see going forward. But we're actually, believe it or not, at about an hour now. I mean, we could probably go on with this for hours. I mean, this has been fascinating to me. Just want to thank our panelists for sharing your thoughts and your insights, your experiences, and helping us make sense of this enduring issue, the social justice issue. And I want to thank our viewers, everyone who joined us today, who took time out of their schedule to do yet another Zoom webinar about this particular topic. So thank you. Stay tuned. For those of you who haven't subscribed to LA Social Science, please do so you can keep track of the reports released on this topic and many others. So thank you and have a great day.